I had exactly 6 seconds before the crystal rim touched his lips and the neurotoxin touched his heart. My fingers felt like ice as I balanced the heavy silver tray, the weight of the vintage Krug bottle suddenly feeling like a lead weight. I wasn't just a waitress anymore. I was a girl standing in the narrow gap between a king and his grave. Around me, the Skyline Lounge was a cathedral of glass and ego. The low-frequency hum of wealth, the clink of porcelain, the muted laughter of people who never checked a price tag felt suffocating. The scent of Tiffany Sterling's expensive gardenia perfume was so thick I could taste it, fighting against the sharp, savory aroma of the Wagyu steaks cooling on the adjacent tables. Outside, a summer storm lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chicago skyscraper, the lightning turning the city into a jagged, monochromatic skeleton. Inside, the air was warm, too warm, and it smelled like a funeral I hadn't been invited to yet. I approached table 5. Dae-Hyun Ryoo sat with his back to the storm, the glittering skyline behind him like a throne of lights. He looked like he'd been carved from obsidian, sharp cheekbones, black hair slicked back with military precision, and a tailored Tom Ford suit that cost more than my brother's entire life-saving surgery. His hand rested on the white tablecloth, fingers drumming a slow, predatory rhythm that made the hair on my arms stand up. Beside him, Tiffany Sterling looked like a masterpiece in white silk. Her diamond engagement ring caught the candlelight, throwing fractured rainbows across the table. She looked like a woman deeply, hopelessly in love. She wasn't. 10 minutes ago, in the shadowed hallway near the ice machine, I'd heard her voice wrap around her words like razor wire as she whispered into her phone. "The sedative is in the crystal flute. Bring the cleaners as soon as he's paralyzed. I want him awake when we take the Empire." The toast was beginning. Tiffany raised her glass, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes were cold, tracking Dae-Hyun's movement with the patience of a sniper. Dae-Hyun reached for his flute, the one I had seen her tamper with while he was distracted by a phone call. 3 seconds. My pulse hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack bone. I could walk away. I could go back to the kitchen, clock out, and tell myself that men like Dae-Hyun Ryoo earned their enemies. But then I thought about my brother, Leo, lying in that hospital bed, and the doctors who fought for him when our insurance said no. I thought about mercy unearned and freely given. I couldn't just watch a man be erased. I didn't think. I moved. As I reached to refill their flutes, I forced my left heel to catch on the edge of the plush carpet. My body lurched forward. It was a clumsy, desperate maneuver. In the eyes of the other diners, I was just a low-level server losing her balance. But as I fell, my hand shot out. I didn't just knock the glass, I snatched it from the table. My thumb brushed against Dae-Hyun's warm skin for a fraction of a second, a violation of every rule of service, every boundary between his world and mine. His dark eyes snapped to mine, calculated and lethal, demanding an explanation for the intrusion. Before he could speak, before his security detail could lunge for me, I brought the crystal flute to my own lips. I didn't sip, I swallowed. The champagne was cold, crisp, and tasted like metallic betrayal. The silence that followed was absolute. Tiffany's face transformed in an instant, the perfect bride mask shattering to reveal a gargoyle of pure, unadulterated terror. She knew. She knew the clock had just reset, and she was no longer holding the timer. The world began to tilt. The golden lights of the lounge stretched into long, sickly yellow ribbons. My legs turned to water, and the silver tray slid from my grip, hitting the marble floor with a deafening, discordant crash that echoed like a gunshot. I felt Dae-Hyun's strong arms catch me before I hit the floor. His grip was iron, his scent of sandalwood and cold steel suddenly the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. I leaned into him, my breath hitching as I used the last of my strength to grab the lapel of his custom suit, staining the expensive fabric with my sweat. "Don't drink it," I mouthed. The words were a ghost of a whisper, barely audible over the rising roar of blood in my ears. I saw his jaw tighten. I saw his hazel eyes bleed back into their natural obsidian darkness as the realization of what I'd done and what his fiancé had tried to do hit him with the force of a physical blow. The last thing I saw was Tiffany Sterling reaching into her white silk clutch, her face twisted in a silent scream of fury. The last thing I felt was Dae-Hyun Ryoo pulling me tighter against his chest, shielding my body with his own as he reached for the weapon hidden beneath his jacket. I didn't just save his life, I just started a war, and as the darkness swallowed me whole, I knew there was no going back to being invisible. The golden warmth of the Skyline Lounge died the moment I hit Dae-Hyun's chest. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath, suspended in the horrified silence of a predator who had just realized the trap was empty. Then the silence shattered. Tiffany's hand emerged from her silk clutch, but it wasn't a lipstick she pulled out, it was a sleek, suppressed pistol. Her face, usually a masterpiece of curated elegance, was now a jagged landscape of desperation. She didn't look at the man she was supposed to marry, she looked at me. I was the variable. I was the trash that had survived the neurotoxin she intended for a king, and in her world, witnesses were an overhead cost that needed to be liquidated. "Kill them!" she shrieked, her voice cracking the refined atmosphere of the lounge. The scream was a starter's pistol for hell. Two men who had been lingering near the bar, men I had served scotch to only 20 minutes ago, stood up in synchronized motion, drawing weapons from beneath their dark blazers. The first round punched into a nearby crystal chandelier, sending a rain of glass diamonds cascading onto the marble floor. Guests screamed, diving under white cloth tables, their expensive dinners forgotten as the cathedral of ego turned into a kill zone. I felt the world slipping away, my nervous system misfiring under the weight of the sedative. My head lolled back, my eyes tracking the frantic strobing of the emergency lights. But I didn't hit the ground. Dae-Hyun Ryoo's grip tightened, his arm hooking beneath my knees, the other anchoring my head against his shoulder. He moved with a terrifying fluid grace that ignored the paralysis creeping through my limbs. "You're not dying tonight, Zora," he growled. It wasn't a comfort, it was a command. He kicked the heavy mahogany table upward, using it as a temporary shield as Tiffany's cleaners opened fire. The wood splintered under a hail of lead, the sound of impact deafening in the enclosed space. Dae-Hyun didn't flinch. He reached into the small of his back, pulling a heavy black handgun that looked like an extension of his own obsidian soul. He fired twice, two rhythmic, clinical thuds, and the man at the bar folded like a discarded rag. "Extraction, now!" Dae-Hyun barked into the mic clipped to his collar. He lunged toward the private service elevator, the one I used to bring up the vintage Krug. Bullets chased our heels, shattering the floor-to-ceiling windows behind us. The summer storm roared into the room, the freezing rain mixing with the smell of gunpowder and expensive steak. Dae-Hyun didn't take the safe route. He didn't wait for his security detail to form a perimeter. Instead, he did something that defied every logic of his position. He shielded me. He twisted his body, putting his own broad, armored back between me and the Sterling gunman. I felt the vibration of a round glancing off his shoulder, the impact making him grunt, but he didn't drop me. He didn't use me as a weight to be discarded. We hit the elevator doors just as a second wave of gunmen burst from the kitchen. Dae-Hyun shoved me into the corner of the small metal box, his body hovering over me like a gargoyle. As the doors slid shut, the last thing I saw was Tiffany Sterling standing in the wreckage of her engagement party, her white silk dress stained with the wine I had spilled, her eyes burning with a promise of a hunt that was only just beginning. The descent was a blur of gravity and darkness. My heart felt like it was beating in slow motion, a heavy, sludge-filled rhythm. Dae-Hyun was looking down at me, his hazel eyes, those hazel contacts, narrowed in a focus so intense it felt physical. He reached out, his thumb brushing a stray curl from my forehead, his touch lingering for a second too long for a man who claimed to have no heart. "Why?" he whispered, the word barely audible over the hum of the elevator cables. I tried to answer, to tell him about Leo, about the hospital on the south side, about how I was tired of being the person who just watched the world happen from the sidelines. But the neurotoxin won. My jaw felt like lead, and my eyelids were iron curtains. The elevator dived into the sub-basement garage. The doors hissed open to a symphony of screeching tires. A black, armored SUV lurched to a halt in front of us, the doors flying open. Dae-Hyun's men spilled out, weapons raised, but he ignored their outstretched hands. He carried me into the back seat himself, sliding into the leather interior without letting go of my hand. "Drive," he commanded, his voice vibrating through the seat and into my spine. "Get my doctor to the loft and tell the Sterlings they just lost their seat at the table." As the SUV roared out of the garage and into the rain-slicked streets of Chicago, the city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope of neon. I felt the warmth of his hand against mine, the hand of a monster, a king, a savior. I was no longer Zora the waitress. I was a casualty of a war I had volunteered for, and as the darkness finally took me, I knew that when I woke up, the world would never look the same again. Inside the SUV, the cold boss didn't look at the road or his phone. He looked at the girl who had swapped his death for her own, and for the first time in his lethal life, Dae-Hyun Ryoo felt the heavy, unfamiliar weight of a debt he couldn't pay with money. He felt the weight of a life. He felt the weight of me. The first thing I registered wasn't the pain, but the silence. It was a cold, sterile silence that felt heavy, like the air inside a pressurized cabin. My eyes fluttered open, the overhead lights piercing through my retinas like needles. I wasn't in a hospital. There was no rhythmic beeping of monitors or the comforting smell of antiseptic. Instead, I was lying on a slate gray leather sofa in a room that felt more like a vault than a home. The industrial loft was a sprawling expanse of polished concrete and exposed steel beams. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the black, churning waters of the Chicago River, but they were reinforced with a subtle spider webbing of ballistic wire. In every corner, the unblinking red eyes of security cameras tracked my every movement. It was a fortress of glass and shadows, an apex predator's nest. I tried to sit up, but my muscles felt like they were made of cooling wax. A sharp, dry cough tore from my throat, and that was when I noticed him. Dae-Hyun Ryoo stood by a minimalist steel desk, his back to me. He had stripped off his suit jacket, and his white dress shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing the thick, corded muscles of his forearms and a glimpse of ink, the tail of a dragon sneaking up from his wrist. The neurotoxin was a customized derivative of tetrodotoxin, he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to hum through the floor. He didn't turn around. Fast acting, designed to paralyze the respiratory system within minutes. You're lucky my physician was already in the building. A few more seconds and you would have been a very beautiful corpse. He finally turned, and the hazel contacts were gone. His true eyes, obsidian, depthless, and terrifyingly sharp, pinned me to the leather. He walked toward me with a predatory slow-motion stride, stopping just inches from where I lay. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer water. He leaned down, his shadow swallowing me whole. "I've spent 10 years surviving the Sterlings and my own family," he whispered, his face a mask of clinical detachment. "Men like me don't get saved by waitresses, Zora. We get set up. So let's skip the fairy tale. Who do you work for? Was the glass swap a play to gain my trust? Did the rival families pay you to be a martyr so you could get inside these walls?" I blinked, the fog in my brain clearing just enough to feel the sting of his words. The gratitude I expected wasn't there. In its place was a cold, calculating suspicion that made me feel more exposed than the gunman in the lounge ever had. "I don't work for anyone," I managed to rasp, my voice sounding like gravel. "I work double shifts at the lounge to pay for a hospital bed on the south side." Dae-Hyun leaned closer, his hand shooting out to grip the back of the sofa next to my head. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco rolled over me. Liar. Nobody throws their life away for a stranger unless there's a payout. Is it a debt? Did Tiffany promise to pay for your brother's surgery if you played the hero and then reported back to her? He reached out, his fingers catching my jaw, forcing me to look up into that dark, lethal gaze. His touch was cold, his thumb pressing into my skin with just enough pressure to remind me that he could snap my neck before I could scream. "Tell me the truth, Zora, before I decide you're more dangerous alive than dead." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the scar on his jaw, the hardness in his mouth, and the profound, echoing loneliness of a man who believed that every act of kindness was a hidden blade. Anger, hot and defiant, flared up through the lingering numbness of the sedative. I jerked my face away from his hand, the effort making my head spin. "You think the world is just a series of transactions, don't you?" I spat, the words gaining strength. "You think everyone has a price because yours probably was paid in blood a long time ago. But I didn't do it for you, Dae-Hyun. I didn't even like you when I served you your first drink. You were just another arrogant suit who didn't see me." I struggled to a seated position, my hand shaking as I gripped the edge of the cushions. "I did it because I spent 3 years watching my mother wither away while people like Tiffany Sterling walked past us like we were invisible. I did it because I heard her voice on that phone, heard the way she discussed ending your life like it was ordering an appetizer. I've seen enough death. I wasn't going to let it happen 3 feet away from me while I held a tray and did nothing." I looked him dead in the eye, my breathing ragged. "Kill me if you want. It wouldn't be the first time a man in a suit ruined my life. But don't you dare tell me I'm a plant. I'm just the girl you ignored at table 5, and I'm the only reason you're breathing right now." The silence returned, but this time it was different. The air in the loft felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Dae-Hyun stood slowly, his expression unchanging, but something shifted in the depths of his obsidian eyes. For the first time, he wasn't looking at me like a puzzle to be solved or a threat to be neutralized. He was looking at me like I was a person. "You're either the most honest woman I've ever met or the most dangerous." He walked over to a nearby sideboard and poured a glass of water, finally bringing it to me. As I took it, our fingers brushed. He didn't pull away this time. His gaze dropped to the bruise forming on my arm where his men had grabbed me during the extraction. "Tiffany Sterling knows you're alive, Zora, and she knows you heard her. In her world, an invisible girl who can talk is a liability that needs to be erased." He leaned back against the steel beam, his arms crossed over his chest. "You saved my life. That creates a debt. And in my world, I don't leave debts unpaid." I took a sip of the water, the coldness hitting the back of my parched throat. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not going back to the south side. It means you're staying here, in the only place the Sterlings can't touch you." He looked out at the dark river, his jaw tightening. You wanted to stop being invisible. Congratulations. You're now the most wanted woman in Chicago, and you're under my protection." I looked at the cameras, then back at the man who was both my savior and my captor. I had traded a waitress uniform for a target on my back, and as the reality of my new life settled in, I realized that the neurotoxin was the easiest part of the night to survive. The real war was just beginning. The dream was of ice and glass until the sound of a heavy door slamming against concrete jolted me awake. I was still on the gray leather sofa, the industrial loft bathed in the bruised light of a Chicago dawn. My body felt heavy, the lingering effects of the neurotoxin clinging to my lungs like soot. But the air in the room had changed. It was no longer sterile. It was electric with a violence that hadn't yet been unleashed. Dae-Hyun was standing across the room, but he wasn't the calm, calculating man from hours before. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his dark hair disheveled, and his eyes, those obsidian pits, were burning with a frantic, dangerous light. On the steel desk in front of him sat a small, familiar cardboard box. My heart stopped. It was the monthly supply of insulin I'd picked up from my brother, Leo, just before my shift at the lounge. Beside the desk, a man in a black tactical vest held a handheld electronic scanner that was emitting a high-pitched rhythmic chirp. With a clinical flick of a pocket knife, Dae-Hyun sliced through the thick insulin box. He didn't pull out a vial. He pulled out a tiny silver disc no larger than a coat button. "Do you have any idea what this is?" Dae-Hyun's voice was a low, terrifying crawl. He held the disc between two fingers, the metal glinting in the morning light. It's Leo's medicine," I whispered, my voice cracking as I tried to stand. My legs wobbled, but the look on his face forced me upright. "It's a military-grade GPS transponder, Zora," he roared, the sound echoing off the steel beams of the ceiling. He threw the tracker at the floor. It skittered across the concrete, coming to a stop at my feet. "It's been broadcasting a high-frequency ping from inside my walls for the last 4 hours. You didn't just walk into my life. You brought a beacon for the Sterling straight into my sanctuary." "I didn't know," I gasped, the cold realization hitting me like a physical blow. "I picked that up from the hospital pharmacy. They said it was a donation, a grant for Leo's treatment." "A grant?" Dae-Hyun laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Tiffany Sterling doesn't give grants. She buys collateral. She didn't just want me dead. She wanted you controlled. She knew you were the only witness, so she tagged your brother's life. If you talked, she'd find him. If you ran to me, she'd follow." He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand closing around my throat, not to choke me, but to pin me against the reinforced glass of the window. The coldness of the pain seeped into my back. His face was inches from mine, his pulse visible and thudding in his neck. "How much did she pay you?" he hissed, the air seeping into my skin. "Is this the war you wanted to start? A clever little play where you act the martyr, get me to bring you home and let your real employers know exactly where I sleep? My men are out there right now burning my secondary servers and scrubbing the perimeter because of a waitress who didn't know." The unfairness of it, the sheer brutal weight of being a pawn in a game I never asked to play, snapped something inside me. The fear that had kept me shivering vanished, replaced with a white-hot, jagged rage. I didn't try to pull his hand away. Instead, I leaned forward, pressing my chest against his, looking straight into the darkness of his eyes. "You think I'm that smart?" I challenged, my voice steady despite the pressure on my throat. "You think I'd risk my brother's only supply of insulin, the only thing keeping a 10-year-old boy alive, just to find out where a monster keeps his desk? Look at me, Dae-Hyun. Look at the girl you saved. I have nothing. No empire, no soldiers, no custom suits. I have a brother who can't breathe on his own, and a debt I'll be paying until I'm in the ground." I reached down to his waistband, my fingers brushing the cold, textured grip of the handgun tucked into his holster. I didn't pull it out. I just rested my hand over his. I whispered, the words vibrating between us. If you truly believe I'm a traitor, then stop talking. If you think I led them here on purpose, then end it. Pull the trigger. Do it now, because I am tired of being the one who suffers for the sins of people like you and Tiffany. Kill me or trust me, but stop hiding behind your paranoia. Dae-Hyun froze. The muscle in his jaw jumped. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the wind howling against the glass and the faint, dying chirp of the tracker on the floor. I could feel the heat of his skin, the tension in his arm, and the moment his grip began to soften. He didn't pull the trigger. He didn't even reach for the gun. He let go of my throat, his hand lingering for a second against my collarbone before he stepped back, looking at me as if he were seeing a ghost. She's at the hospital, I realized, the blood draining from my face. Tiffany, if she tracked the insulin here, she knows I'm with you. She'll go for Leo. Dae-Hyun turned back to the desk, his eyes returning to their clinical, lethal focus. He picked up a burner phone and hit speed dial. Team 2, move to the south side. Secure the pediatric ward. Anyone who isn't staff and enters that hallway, neutralize them. He looked over my shoulder, the silver disc of the tracker crushed beneath his boot. You're right, Zora. This isn't a transaction anymore. What is it? I asked. It's a debt, he said, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that wasn't rage or suspicion. It was a promise, and I'm going to make the Sterlings pay for every second you spent being afraid. The industrial sanctuary was no longer just a hiding spot. It was a war room, and as Dae-Hyun began barking orders in rapid-fire Korean, I realized I had finally stopped being invisible. I was a target, yes, but I was also the only person who had ever dared a king to kill her, and won. The panic in my chest didn't subside when the shouting stopped. It only deepened, turning into a heavy, cold anchor as I watched Dae-Hyun pacing the length of a loft. He looked like a storm contained within 4 walls. The silence of the industrial sanctuary was now punctuated only by the low hum of his encrypted servers and the distant rhythmic sloshing of the river. My brother, I said, my voice finally finding its edge. If Tiffany's people are at that hospital, he's a sitting duck. He can't move, Dae-Hyun. He doesn't even know his life is being used as a bargaining chip. Dae-Hyun stopped mid-stride. He turned to look at me, but he didn't look worried. Instead, he looked satisfied, a slow, dark smile creeping onto his face, the kind of smile a shark wears before the hit. He walked to the steel desk and picked up a tablet, tapping the screen before sliding it across the cold surface toward me. Look, he commanded. I looked. It was a live security feed. I recognized the specialized medical equipment, the blue-tinted lighting of an ICU, and the small, frail form of my brother Leo sleeping under a weighted blanket. But the room was wrong. The walls weren't the peeling beige of the Southside County Hospital. They were pristine white, decorated with state-of-the-art monitors that looked like they belonged in a billionaire's private clinic. Where is he? I whispered, my heart skip jumping. What did you do? I moved him 3 hours ago, Dae-Hyun said, his voice dropping into that melodic, terrifyingly calm register. While you were still unconscious from the sedative. He's in a private wing of the St. Jude Medical Center downtown. It's a facility I happen to own through a series of shell companies. He has his own security detail, his own team of world-class specialists, and enough backup power to keep him breathing for a month if the city went dark. Relief washed over me so violently I had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. Tiffany couldn't touch him. He was safe. But as I watched the steady rise and fall of Leo's chest on the screen, a new, sharper fear began to take root in the pit of my stomach. How? I asked, looking up at him. That surgery? The debt I've been carrying? It's hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why would you? I didn't do it out of the goodness of my heart, Zora, he interrupted, stepping into my space until I could feel the radiant heat of his body. I don't have one of those. I did it because leverage is the only currency that matters in my world. I didn't just move him. I bought his medical debt. Every penny you owed to the county, every cent you were supposed to pay for his upcoming surgery, it's all then transferred. I bought the hospital, the debt, and his next breath. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a terrifying possessiveness. It wasn't the touch of a lover, it was the touch of an owner inspecting a valuable asset. "You're not a prisoner, Zora," he whispered, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine with a gravity that felt physical. "You're my most important investment. You saved the head of the Ryoo family. That makes you a queen in the eyes of my men and a target in the eyes of my enemies. I've secured your brother's life to ensure your absolute loyalty. As long as you are with me, he thrives. If you ever decide to run back to Tiffany, or if you ever think about leaking my coordinates, well, I'm sure you understand how the math works." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The grant I thought I'd received from the pharmacy hadn't been from Tiffany. It had been Dae-Hyun, laying the groundwork to own me before he even knew my name. I wasn't just a waitress who had gotten lucky. I was a casualty of a war between two monsters, and I had just been traded from one cage to another. "You bastard," I breathed, the words thick with the metallic taste of the trail. "I prefer the term pragmatist," he countered, his hand dropping to rest on my shoulder, his grip firm. "You wanted power, Zora. You wanted to stop being the invisible girl who watches the world bleed. Well, here it is. You are now tied to the most powerful shipping empire in the Midwest. Your brother will get his surgery. He will walk again. But in return, I own your time, your skills, and your silence." I looked at his hand on my shoulder, then back at the screen showing my brother. Leo looked so peaceful, so safe. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to wonder if we'd be evicted or if the power would stay on. But the cost was my soul. I was no longer a server of drinks. I was a servant to the throne of a Mafia King. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Absolute dominion," he said, his gaze intensifying. "The Sterlings think they can use you to get to me. I'm going to use you to dismantle them. I'm going to turn you into the weapon they never saw coming. You saved a king, Zora. Now you're going to help me burn his enemies to the ground." He stepped away, returning to the shadows near the windows, leaving me standing in the center of his concrete palace. I was bound to him by a debt that couldn't be repaid with money, only with blood and loyalty. As the sun finally broke over the Chicago skyline, I realized that I had finally gotten what I wanted. I was no longer invisible. But as I stared at the man who now held my brother's life in his hands, I wondered if being seen was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to me. I was his investment. I was his asset. And as the war for the city began to howl outside, I knew I was his, body and soul. The basement of the stronghold didn't smell like luxury. It smelled of cold concrete, spent brass, and the biting metallic tang of gun oil. It was a subterranean world where the cold boss shed his tailored armor and became a predator in plain clothes. Dae-Hyun stood by a heavy steel table, his movements economical and terrifyingly precise as he laid out a compact, matte black Glock. "The Sterlings didn't try to kill you at the lounge because you were important," he said, his voice echoing flatly against the soundproofed walls. "They did it because you were easy. In their world, a waitress is just a piece of furniture that occasionally speaks. If you're going to survive standing next to me, you have to stop being easy." He gestured to the weapon. I didn't move. My hands, still prone to slight tremors since the neurotoxin incident, felt heavy at my sides. "I've spent my life carrying trays, Dae-Hyun, not lead." "Then learn a new weight," he commanded. He didn't wait for my consent. He moved behind me, his presence a sudden, overwhelming wall of heat against my back. The physical distance between us vanished, replaced by a tension that felt more dangerous than the firearm on the table. He reached around, his large, calloused hands covering mine, forcing my fingers to wrap around the textured grip of the pistol. "Your stance is too narrow," he murmured, his breath ghosting against the sensitive skin of my neck, sending a localized electrical storm through my nervous system. "Shoulders back, feet apart. You need to be an anchor, Zora. If you're light on your feet, the recoil will break you." He kicked my heels further apart with his boot, a firm, clinical adjustment that felt jarringly intimate. I could feel the rhythmic thud of his heart against my shoulder blade, steady, slow, a contrast to the frantic jackrabbiting of my own. He didn't pull away once I was positioned. Instead, he stayed coiled around me, his hands guiding mine to raise the weapon toward the paper silhouette downrange. "Focus on the front sight," he whispered, his voice dropping into a low, melodic vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight to my marrow. "Don't think about the man who might be standing there. Think about the debt. Think about Leo. If you miss, Tiffany wins. If you pull the trigger, you're the one who decides who lives." The air in the range felt thin, charged with a high-voltage current. Every point of contact, his chest against my spine, his palms pressing my knuckles into the steel, felt like a brand. I was hyper-aware of the scent of him, sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and a darker, sharper note of adrenaline. "Squeeze. Don't pull. Let the shot surprise you." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling his thumb graze the back of my hand, and then I squeezed. The report was a violent, deafening crack that vibrated through my bones. The recoil slammed into my palms, but Dae-Hyun's strength acted as a secondary frame, absorbing the shock before it could throw me off balance. The bullet punched a jagged hole through the paper target's shoulder. "Better than I expected for a girl who's only ever handled champagne flutes," he said, and I could hear the ghost of a dark, satisfied smile in his tone. I turned in the circle of his arms, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. The adrenaline was a fire in my veins, stripping away the fear and the resentment, leaving only the raw, pulsing reality of the man standing inches from me. Up close, his obsidian eyes weren't just cold, they were hungry. They were the eyes of a man who had spent his life owning everything, but feeling nothing. "I'm not just an investment, am I?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of defiance and a new, terrifying desire. Dae-Hyun didn't answer with words. He reached up, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw, his thumb lingering on the lower curve of my lip. The possessiveness was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer the look of a collector, but the look of a man who had found something he was willing to burn the city to keep. "You're a liability, Zora," he whispered, his face descending toward mine. When his lips met mine, it wasn't the soft, tentative kiss of a romance novel. It was a collision. It tasted of smoke and iron, a desperate, dangerous acknowledgement of the bond forged in blood and betrayal. I reached up, my fingers curling into his collar of his shirt, pulling him closer as if I could anchor myself to his darkness. The range, the cameras, the war outside, it all blurred into a background of static. He broke the kiss just enough to rest his forehead against mine, his breathing as ragged as mine. For a moment, the cold boss was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had just realized he had walked into a trap of his own making. "That," he rasped, his eyes locking onto mine with a lethal intensity, "is the last time you'll be easy to read. From now on, you are a shadow at my side. You aren't the girl who saves the king anymore, Zora. You're the reason the king's enemies don't sleep." He stepped back, the cold air of the basement rushing into the space where his body had been. The intimacy was gone, replaced by the clinical focus of a general. He gestured to the Glock again. "Again," he commanded, "and this time aim for the heart." As I raised the gun, my grip was no longer shaking. The server from table 5 was dead, buried under the weight of the steel in my hand and the heat of the kiss still burning on my lips. I was a weapon in the making, and as the next round tore through the silence, I realized I didn't want to be invisible anymore. I wanted to be the last thing Tiffany Sterling ever saw. The transition from the warmth of Dae-Hyun's arms to the clinical cold of the strategy room felt like a plunge into icy water. I stood before the wall of monitors watching the blinking red dots that represented Dae-Hyun's empire, and I knew that the defense was no longer enough. We were waiting to be picked off. Paranoia was a slow-acting poison, and it was starting to cloud the judgment of the most dangerous man I had ever met. "We're playing her game," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the loft. Dae-Hyun was staring at a topographical map of the Chicago riverfront, his jaw set in a line of permanent tension. "Tiffany thinks I'm a victim. She thinks I'm the trash you dragged into your vault to keep quiet. Let's give her exactly what she expects." Dae-Hyun turned, his obsidian eyes narrowing. "Explain." "I escape," I said, stepping closer to him, the weight of the Glock he had gifted me still familiar against my hip. "I show up at one of the Sterling properties, beaten, terrified, and looking for a way out. I tell her you've been holding me against my will. I tell her that I saw where you keep the manifests and that I'm willing to sell you out to save my brother." "No," he said instantly, the word like a gunshot. He crossed the room, his presence looming over me, a physical wall of protection and possessiveness. "You have no idea what they do to people who return with information. Tiffany Sterling doesn't have a heart, Zora. She has a ledger. If you aren't useful within the first 5 minutes, she'll have you buried in the foundation of her father's new hotel." "I will be useful," I countered, reaching out to grab his forearm, my fingers digging into the rolled silk of his sleeve. "I'll tell her about the secret delivery at Dock 42. I'll tell her that your uncle has been funneling ghost shipments through the northern bottleneck and that you're vulnerable there on Thursday night. It's the one thing she wants, a way to dismantle your shipping reign without a frontal assault." I saw the calculation flare in his eyes. It was a perfect lie because it contained a grain of truth. His uncle was a snake, but he wasn't the one controlling the northern routes. Thursday night was when Dae-Hyun's elite enforcers moved their heavy artillery. "It's a suicide mission," he whispered, his hand coming up to cut my face, his thumb tracing the bruise on my arm that was finally starting to fade. "I taught you how to shoot, Dae-Hyun. Now let me show you that I've been paying attention to how you rule. To beat a monster, you have to invite it into your house." The escape was a masterpiece of orchestrated trauma. Dae-Hyun's men dropped me 3 blocks from the Sterling estate in the middle of a torrential downpour. My clothes were torn, my hair a matted mess of rain and dirt, and the makeup artist on Dae-Hyun's payroll had given me a split lip and a darkened eye that looked disturbingly real. I collapsed at the iron gates of the Sterling compound, screaming for help until the black-clad security guards dragged me inside. They didn't take me to a parlor or a guest room. They dragged me straight down into the gut of the house, a basement that smelled of mildew and old secrets. Tiffany Sterling was waiting for me. She looked pristine, a stark contrast to my ruined state, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and holding a glass of the same vintage Krug I had once served her. She looked down from me from a high-backed chair, her expression one of bored cruelty. "The little hero returns," she purred, the sound of her voice making my skin crawl. She gestured to a guard, who shoved me into a cold metal chair and secured my wrists with zip ties that bit into my skin. "I thought you'd be at the bottom of the river by now, Zora. Dae-Hyun isn't known for his hospitality toward the help." "He's a monster," I gasped, letting a sob rack my shoulders. The fear wasn't hard to fake. The basement was a tomb, and I was entirely alone. "He took my brother. He says he owns us. I heard what you said on the phone that night. I know you wanted him paralyzed. I don't care about him anymore. I just want my brother back." Tiffany leaned forward, the scent of her gardenia perfume suddenly suffocating. "And why should I believe a word that comes out of that lying mouth?" "I know about Doc 42, I whispered, looking up at her through the veil of my matted hair. "I saw the manifests in his loft. He's moving the entire winter surplus through the northern bottleneck on Thursday night. His uncle set it up. He thinks he's safe because he moved the security detail to the south side to look for you." Tiffany froze. The name of the doc and the mention of the uncle were the keys to the vault. I saw the greed ignite in her eyes, the hunger for a killing blow that would finally settle the Sterling Ryoo war. She stood up, walking a slow circle around me, her heels clicking like a countdown on the concrete floor. "If this is true," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I'll make sure your brother is the most well-cared-for boy in the city. If you're lying—" She stopped in front of me and tipped my head back with the cold rim of her glass. "I'll make sure he's the one who pays for your mistake." She turned to her lead enforcer. "Keep her here. No food, no water, and no sleep until Thursday morning. If our scouts confirm movement at the docks, we move in. If not, kill her." The door slammed shut, and the heavy thud of a deadbolt echoed through the room. I was alone in the dark, my wrists throbbing, my heart a frantic drum in my ears. I was a prisoner in the heart of the enemy's lair, a piece of meat dangled to lure a predator into a trap. I leaned my head back against the cold stone wall and closed my eyes, visualizing the front sight of the Glock and the warmth of Dae-Hyun's breath on my neck. The risk was absolute, and the clock was ticking. I had invited the monster in. Now I just had to survive long enough to see the house burn. The darkness of the Sterling basement was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating shroud that smelled of damp earth and the lingering, sweet rot of Tiffany's gardenia perfume. For 36 hours, I had been an object in the corner of a room, ignored by guards who saw me only as a timer counting down to their victory. My wrists were raw beneath the plastic bite of the zip ties, and the hunger in my stomach had long since sharpened into a dull, throbbing ache. But beneath the physical collapse, my mind was a razor. I was counting the seconds, visualizing the map of the Chicago riverfront, and waiting for the world to explode. Above me, the house suddenly came alive. I heard the frantic clicking of heels, the bark of orders in sharp, panicked Italian, and the heavy thud of tactical boots sprinting toward the garage. Tiffany's scouts had confirmed the movement. The ghost shipments were moving. The bait had been swallowed whole. Half an hour later, the door to my cell creaked open. A guard grabbed me by the hair, hauling me upright with a sneer. He dragged me into the back of a black van, and we sped toward the industrial wasteland of the north side. They wanted me to watch. They wanted to rub my face in the destruction of the man they thought I had betrayed. We arrived at a ridge overlooking Dock 42. The warehouse was a massive, rusted skeleton sitting on the edge of the black water, its windows dark and uninviting. Below us, Tiffany's elite strike team, 40 men in tactical gear, moved with silent, lethal efficiency. They breached the perimeter, their silencers whispering as they eliminated the dummy guards Dae-Hyun had placed like chess pieces. Tiffany stood at the edge of the ridge, her binoculars raised, her face illuminated by the distant glow of the city. She looked like a goddess of war, her white trench coat stark against the rain-slicked concrete. "Enter the facility," she commanded into her radio. "I want Ryoo's head on a spike before the sun comes up." I watched as the last of her men disappeared into the gut of the warehouse. My heart hit a tempo I didn't know it could sustain. This was the moment. The silence of the night was absolute, heavy with the weight of the men who had just walked into their own tomb. Then the world turned white. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a pressure wave that flattened the grass on the ridge and shattered the windows of the van behind us. A column of fire erupted from the center of the warehouse, a roar of orange and crimson that reached for the low-hanging clouds. The C4 Dae-Hyun had rigged in the foundation didn't just collapse the building, it vaporized it. The shock wave turned the warehouse into a rain of jagged steel and fire, and the screams of the men inside were silenced before they could even begin. Tiffany let out a strangled animal cry, her binoculars falling to the ground, her army, her leverage, her cleaners decimated in a single calculated heartbeat. The firelight danced in my eyes as I leaned against the van, a slow, jagged smile spreading across my face. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "You're lying," Tiffany whispered, turning towards me, her face a mask of fractured vanity. She lunged for me, her fingers clawing at my throat. You set this up! You—" A single thud echoed from the shadows behind her. The guard holding me didn't even have time to shout before he collapsed, a neat, clinical hole appearing in the center of his forehead. Out of the darkness stepped a figure that looked like it had been born from the smoke and the wreckage below. Dae-Hyun Ryoo didn't look like the man who had just escaped a hit. He looked like the man who invented the concept. He moved with a terrifying, liquid stillness, his handgun raised, his obsidian eyes fixed entirely on me. He ignored Tiffany as if she were a ghost, stepping over the bodies of her enforcers until he was standing inches from my face. With a flick of a combat knife, he sliced through my zip ties. The blood rushed back into my hands with a stinging electric heat. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask if the plan had worked. He simply reached out and cupped the back of my head, pulling me into his chest with a force that knocked the remaining breath from my lungs. "I told you," he whispered against my hair, his voice a low, rough vibration. "I don't leave debts unpaid." I leaned into him, my fingers curling into the damp fabric of his tactical vest. The scent of him, smoke, steel, and that familiar sandalwood, was the only thing that made the world stop spinning. We stood there on the ridge, the fire from the docks reflecting in the glass of his loft miles away, while Tiffany Sterling hovered in the background, a broken queen in a ruined kingdom. Dae-Hyun pulled back just enough to look at me, his thumb tracing the split lip the makeup artist had given me, now mixed with real blood from the guard's rough handling. The suspicion that had once defined his gaze was gone, replaced by a synchronization so deep that it felt like we shared a single pulse. "The van is waiting," he said, his hand finding mine and gripping it with a finality that signaled the end of my life as a server. "We have a wedding to attend, Zora, and I think it's time we showed them what happens when they try to poison a king." As he led me away from the fire and toward the armored USV, I realized I wasn't just his investment or his asset anymore. I was his shadow. I was his partner. And as the docks continued to burn behind us, I knew that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being served a death sentence. I was the one carrying it. The transformation was absolute. The girl who had spent 3 years scrubbing industrial kitchen floors and hiding behind a black server's apron was gone, buried beneath the weight of midnight blue silk and $3 million in borrowed diamonds. As the armored SUV glided toward the Sterling estate, I looked at my reflection in the tinted glass. My hair was swept into a sharp, architectural twist, and my eyes, highlighted with a smoky, lethal precision, looked back at me with the cold clarity of someone who had already seen the end of the world. Dae-Hyun sat beside me, a dark god in a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin. He didn't look at his phone or his manifests. He looked at me, his hand resting on my silk-covered knee, his thumb tracing a slow, possessive rhythm. The air between us was no longer charged with suspicion. It was a synchronized hum of impending violence. "Tonight, you aren't the witness, Zora," he said, his voice a low, melodic warning. "You are the verdict. Walk like you own the ground beneath your feet, because by midnight you will." The Sterling Charity Gala was a masquerade of the highest order, a gathering of the city's most powerful monsters dressed in couture. As we stepped into the grand ballroom, the scent of 5,000 white lilies fought the smell of expensive champagne. Heads turned. Hushed whispers rippled through the crowd like a shock wave. To the elite, I was a mystery, a striking new power player on the arm of the Ryoo King. To the Sterlings, I was a ghost. I spotted Tiffany across the room. She was wearing a gown of ivory lace, the perfect bride once more, standing on a raised dais. She looked triumphant, her father beside her as they prepared to announce the merger of their shipping interests, a merger built on the assumption that Dae-Hyun was a dead man. When her eyes found mine, her wineglass trembled, the blood drained from her face, her carefully curated mask cracking as she realized the girl she had left in a basement cell was now standing in the center of her throne room. Dae-Hyun leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear as if sharing a lover's secret. "The audio bridge is established. Give her the cue." I straightened my spine and raised my chin, offering Tiffany a slow, jagged smile. It was the signal. Tiffany stepped to the microphone, her voice forced and brittle as she attempted to begin her speech. "Tonight, we celebrate a new era of cooperation and strength in Chicago." Suddenly, the speakers didn't hum, they roared. The upbeat jazz quartet was cut off by a sharp digital screech. Then a voice filled the ballroom, not Tiffany's polished public persona, but the raw, razor-wire hiss of the woman in the shadowed hallway of the lounge. "The sedative is in his glass. Bring the cleaners as soon as he's paralyzed. I want him awake when we take the empire." The silence that followed was more deafening than the explosion at the docks. 500 of the city's most influential people froze, their glasses half raised. Tiffany looked like a puppet with its strings cut, her mouth opening and closing in a silent scream. "The waitress is trash. If she talks, kill her brother first. I want her to watch him stop breathing before I put a bullet in her head." The collective intake of breath from the crowd was like a winter wind. In the world of the high-level syndicates, betrayal was expected, but sloppy, documented cruelty was a death sentence. Tiffany's father stepped away from her as if she were a live grenade. The elders of the rival families, men who held the keys to the city's infrastructure, turned their backs as one. In under 60 seconds, Tiffany Sterling had gone from the city's most eligible bride to a pariah. Dae-Hyun didn't move. He stood in the center of the floor, the absolute master of the moment. He raised his glass, the same vintage Krug Tiffany loved, and looked her dead in the eye. "To loyalty," he said, his voice carrying through the hushed room without the need for a microphone. The fall was instantaneous. Security guards who had been on the Sterling payroll began to melt into the shadows, unwilling to die for a sinking ship. Tiffany lunged for the microphone, her face twisted in a mask of primal fury. "It's a lie! He's a monster! "The only monster in this room, Tiffany," I said, stepping forward into the light, my voice steady and cold, "is the one who thought an invisible girl couldn't hear." She looked at me, her ivory lace stained with the metaphorical blood of her own confession. Her social standing, her criminal leverage, and her father's legacy vanished in the time it took for the recording to loop. She was no longer a princess. She was a target. As the city's elite began to clear a path for us, Dae-Hyun tucked my arm back into his. We walked toward the exit, the diamonds at my throat catching the light of a world we had just set on fire. The server from table 5 was gone forever. As we stepped out into the freezing Chicago night, I didn't feel like a waitress, and I didn't feel like an investment. I felt like the storm. "One more stop," Dae-Hyun whispered as the SUV doors closed. "The rooftop. It's time to close the account." The cold at the top of the Sterling Tower was absolute, a biting, sharp-edged wind that whipped the midnight blue silk of my dress around my legs like a restless sea. Below us, Chicago was a grid of electric gold, oblivious to the fact that its power structure had just been decapitated. I stood near the edge of the helipad, the diamonds at my throat feeling heavier than they had in the ballroom. Behind me, the heavy steel door groaned on its hinges. Tiffany Sterling stumbled onto the roof, her ivory lace gown torn and dragging in the puddles of freezing rain. The perfect bride was gone, replaced by a ghost with hollow eyes and a trembling jaw. She didn't have her guards. She didn't have her father. She had only the small chrome-plated pistol she had pulled from her garter. "You took everything," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "My name, my family, my future. You were supposed to be nobody, a background character, a girl who pours wine and disappears when the lights go out." I didn't reach for the Glock tucked into my hidden pocket. I didn't have to. I stood my ground, my feet shoulder-width apart, the anchor Dae-Hyun had taught me to be. I looked at her not with hatred, but with a clinical, quiet pity. "I was never nobody, Tiffany," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the gale. "I was just the one you didn't think was worth looking at. That was your mistake. You thought the world was divided into kings and furniture. You forgot that furniture can see and hear everything." With a cry of primal rage, Tiffany raised the pistol. Her hand was shaking, her grip amateur and desperate. In that split second, I didn't see the socialite. I saw the silhouette from the range. I moved before she could squeeze the trigger, a fluid, predatory blur. I stepped inside her guard, my hand catching her wrist and twisting it upward. The gun discharged, the flash illuminating the rain for a heartbeat as the bullet went wild into the dark sky. I didn't stop there. I drove my elbow into her ribs, knocking the remaining breath from her lungs, and swept her legs out from under her. She hit the wet concrete with a dull thud, the chrome pistol skittering across the roof and disappearing over the ledge. I stood over her, breathing hard, the adrenaline of familiar, surging fire in my veins. I could have ended it then. I could have been the monster she accused me of being. "I don't need to kill you, Tiffany," I whispered, looking down at her as she clawed at the concrete. "Dae-Hyun's cleaners are already in the elevator. You're going to spend the rest of your life learning what it's like to be invisible." The rooftop door swung open again, and Dae-Hyun stepped out. He didn't look at Tiffany. He looked only at me, his obsidian eye scanning my body for injuries before settling on my face with a look of profound, terrifying pride. He walked to my side, his hand finding the small of my back, his touch the only warmth in the freezing night. "The account is closed," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. He gestured to the men in black tactical gear who swarmed the roof to haul Tiffany away. She screamed my name as they dragged her into the shadows, a frantic, dying sound that was swallowed by the Chicago wind. I didn't look back. I leaned into Dae-Hyun, my head resting on his shoulder as the weight of the last week finally settled into my bones. "Is it over?" I asked. "It's not," he said, pulling me closer. "It's just beginning." 1 year later, the snow fell over Lake Michigan in silent, heavy flakes, covering the gray concrete of the fortress in a shroud of pristine white. I stood on the balcony of the penthouse, wrapped in a fur-lined coat, watching the ice floes drift like broken glass on the water. Inside, I could hear the rhythmic clack of chess pieces. My brother, Leo, sat across from Dae-Hyun, his legs, now strong and fully recovered, tucked under the chair. He laughed as he captured one of Dae-Hyun's knights, a sound that was the only miracle I ever needed. The Ryoo Empire was different now. It was legitimate in the ways that mattered and lethal in the ways that kept us safe. We had traded the raw violence of the streets for the quiet, absolute power of the boardroom and the docks. Dae-Hyun walked onto the balcony, 2 glasses of vintage Krug in his hands. He didn't look like a mafia boss this night. He looked like a man who had finally found a reason to stop looking over his shoulder. He handed me a glass, his fingers lingering against mine. "Thinking about table 5?" he asked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Thinking about the note," I replied, raising the glass to the city skyline. "Thinking about how many people are sitting in that lounge right now, looking at their servers and seeing nothing." He leaned against the railing beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. Equal partners, synchronized hearts. I was no longer the girl who served the wine, and I was no longer the investment he had bought to ensure loyalty. I was the queen of a kingdom built on concrete and winter wind. "To the invisible ones," I said, the champagne cold and crisp on my tongue. "To us," he whispered, pulling me into the warmth of his embrace. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the 2 monsters who watched over it from the clouds. Inside, we ruled. And as the snow continued to fall, hiding the blood of the past and making everything look new, I knew I would never be invisible again.